Picture this. You're watching a Disney movie, the villain meets their inevitable end, and something feels satisfying. Not just because good triumphed over evil, but because something deeper clicked into place. That satisfaction isn't accidental. It's engineered. For nearly a century, Disney has been conducting what amounts to a massive psychological experiment, using villain endings as the test subject. Every time a Disney antagonist meets their fate, whether they fall from great heights, transform into something powerless, or destroy themselves through their own obsessions, the audience experiences a carefully crafted emotional response. But here's the disturbing part. These endings reveal far more about the psychology of the viewers than they do about the villains themselves. Consider the pattern that emerges when examining how Disney villains meet their end across decades of storytelling. There's a deliberate methodology at work, a systematic approach that goes far beyond simple narrative convenience. Some villains face external punishment, defeated by heroes or natural forces. Others experience poetic justice, where their own flaws become the instrument of their downfall. Still others transform, becoming powerless versions of their former selves. Each category serves a specific psychological function for the audience. The most unsettling realization is that Disney has been training audiences from childhood to accept certain types of justice as natural and satisfying. When the evil queen in Snow White transforms into a hideous hag before plummeting to her demise, audiences don't just witness punishment, they experience a complex emotional cocktail of moral satisfaction, aesthetic justice, and psychological closure. The villain's vanity, her greatest weapon, becomes her ultimate weakness. This isn't just storytelling, it's moral programming. What makes this pattern particularly fascinating is how it evolves alongside societal changes. Early Disney villains faced swift, decisive endings that reflected the moral certainties of their era. But as audiences became more psychologically sophisticated, Disney's approach adapted. Villains began experiencing more complex psychological journeys toward their inevitable fate, reflecting changing attitudes toward justice, redemption, and moral complexity. The psychological manipulation goes deeper than simple entertainment. Disney has discovered something profound about human nature. Audiences derive specific types of satisfaction from witnessing certain types of villain endings. The fall from great heights satisfies our desire for cosmic justice. The transformation into powerlessness appeals to our need for role reversal. The self-destruction through obsession validates our belief in moral cause and effect. Each ending type triggers different psychological rewards, creating a comprehensive system of moral conditioning. This systematic approach raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of justice and entertainment. Why do audiences find certain types of villain endings more satisfying than others? What does our enjoyment of these carefully crafted demises reveal about our own psychological makeup? And perhaps most disturbingly, has Disney been deliberately shaping societal attitudes toward justice and morality through these seemingly innocent animated endings? The evidence suggests that Disney understood something about human psychology that goes far beyond simple entertainment value. They recognize that how a villain meets their end carries enormous psychological weight for audiences, particularly young ones whose moral frameworks are still developing. By controlling these endings, Disney gained the power to influence how entire generations think about justice, consequences, and moral resolution. The pattern becomes even more intriguing when examined across different eras of Disney storytelling. Each generation of villain endings reflects not just evolving animation techniques or storytelling sophistication, but changing psychological approaches to moral education. The company has essentially been conducting a real-time study of how different types of villain endings affect audience psychology and moral development. What emerges from this analysis is a disturbing possibility. Disney may have been less interested in simply telling stories than in conducting a vast psychological experiment on moral conditioning. The consistency of their approach, the deliberate evolution of their methods, and the careful attention to audience psychological response suggests a level of intentionality that goes far beyond entertainment. The most unsettling aspect of this pattern is how naturally audiences accept it. Few viewers consciously analyze why they find certain villain endings satisfying, while others feel incomplete or unsatisfying. This unconscious acceptance suggests that Disney's psychological programming has been remarkably successful, creating generations of viewers whose moral expectations have been shaped by carefully crafted animated endings. This raises profound questions about the relationship between entertainment and psychological manipulation. When does storytelling become conditioning? At what point does moral education cross the line into psychological programming? And what are the long-term societal implications of having our moral instincts shaped by a single entertainment company's vision of justice? The psychological framework that would govern Disney villain endings for decades was established in the company's earliest animated features, creating a template so effective that audiences still respond to these patterns nearly a century later. The genius of Disney's approach wasn't just in creating memorable villains, it was in engineering their downfall to trigger specific psychological responses that would become deeply embedded in audience expectations. Snow White's evil queen represents perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated villain ending in early animation. Her transformation from beautiful sorceress to hideous hag before plummeting from the cliff face operates on multiple psychological levels simultaneously. The audience witnesses not just punishment, but a complete reversal of everything the queen valued. Her vanity, the driving force behind every evil action, becomes the instrument of her destruction. This isn't coincidental. It's a carefully constructed psychological equation designed to provide maximum emotional satisfaction. The transformation sequence itself reveals Disney's understanding of deep-seated human psychology. Audiences don't just want the queen defeated, they want her power stripped away in the most psychologically devastating manner possible. By making her witness her own physical deterioration before facing her final fate, Disney created a form of poetic justice that satisfies multiple psychological needs. The desire for proportional punishment, the comfort of seeing evil recognized and rejected, and the satisfaction of watching power structures collapse. This pattern of transformation as punishment became a cornerstone of Disney's psychological toolkit. The villain's greatest strength becomes their ultimate weakness, creating a sense of cosmic justice that resonates with fundamental human concepts of fairness and moral balance. But the psychological manipulation goes deeper than simple retribution. It establishes the expectation that evil will be punished, not just externally, but through the corruption of the villain's own nature. Maleficent's original ending in Sleeping Beauty expanded this psychological framework in disturbing ways. Her transformation into a dragon represents something far more complex than simple shapeshifting. It's a manifestation of inner evil becoming outer reality. The psychological message is clear. Evil cannot hide behind beauty or power indefinitely. Eventually, the true nature will be revealed, and that revelation will be the beginning of the end. The audience psychology at work here is particularly sophisticated. Disney understood that simply having Prince Philip defeat Maleficent in her human form would lack emotional impact. But by forcing her to reveal her true monstrous nature before facing defeat, the ending provides psychological closure on multiple levels. The audience feels validated in their moral judgment, satisfied with the proportional response to evil, and comforted by the restoration of natural order. These early patterns established crucial psychological rules that would govern audience expectations for generations. Villains couldn't simply lose, they had to be diminished. They couldn't just be defeated, they had to participate in their own downfall. Most importantly, their punishment had to reflect their specific type of evil, creating a sense of moral symmetry that satisfied deep psychological needs for justice and order. The conditioning effect of these early films cannot be overstated. Children who grew up with these movies internalized specific expectations about how evil should be punished and how justice should manifest. The psychological programming was so effective that audiences continue to find satisfaction in villain endings that follow these established patterns even decades later. What makes this conditioning particularly insidious is how it shapes real-world expectations about justice and punishment. The Disney model suggests that true justice requires not just stopping evil, but humiliating it, transforming it, making it complicit in its own destruction. This psychological framework extends far beyond entertainment, influencing how audiences think about punishment, justice, and moral resolution in their own lives. The early villain endings also revealed Disney's sophisticated understanding of gender psychology and power dynamics. The evil queen and Maleficent weren't just evil, they were powerful women whose authority threatened traditional structures. Their endings served a dual psychological function, satisfying moral expectations while reinforcing social hierarchies. The queen's vanity-based destruction suggested that female power rooted in beauty and manipulation was inherently unstable. Maleficent's monstrous transformation implied that female authority that challenged male heroism was fundamentally unnatural. This psychological programming was particularly effective because it operated below conscious awareness. Audiences experienced emotional satisfaction without necessarily understanding why these specific endings felt so right. The unconscious acceptance of these patterns created a generation of viewers whose moral intuitions had been shaped by Disney's psychological framework. The consistency of this approach across early Disney films suggests deliberate intention rather than coincidental storytelling choices. Each villain ending was carefully crafted to reinforce the same psychological patterns. Evil must be recognized, transformed, and ultimately destroyed through its own nature. This systematic approach created a comprehensive moral education system disguised as entertainment. Perhaps most disturbingly, these early patterns established the expectation that justice requires the complete destruction of evil rather than its rehabilitation or redemption. The psychological framework Disney created leaves no room for moral complexity or second chances. Villains must be eliminated, preferably through their own flaws, to provide proper emotional closure. This binary approach to morality has profound implications for how audiences process real-world conflicts and moral dilemmas. The Foundation era established more than just storytelling conventions. It created a psychological template for moral thinking that would influence generations of viewers. But as we'll see, Disney's approach would evolve dramatically as societal attitudes changed, and the company recognized opportunities to conduct even more sophisticated psychological experiments on audience expectations. The Disney Renaissance era didn't just revolutionize animation. It fundamentally altered the psychological contract between Disney and its audience regarding villain endings. Where earlier films had established clear rules about how evil should be punished, the Renaissance period introduced something far more disturbing: the systematic psychological breakdown of villains through their own obsessions. This wasn't just storytelling evolution, it was a deliberate shift toward more sophisticated psychological manipulation. Scar's ending in The Lion King represents perhaps the most psychologically complex villain demise in Disney history. Unlike the Evil Queen's transformation or Maleficent's monstrous revelation, Scar faces something more psychologically devastating: betrayal by his own allies. The hyenas whom he had manipulated and used throughout the film turn on him in his moment of greatest vulnerability. This ending operates on multiple psychological levels that reveal Disney's increasingly sophisticated understanding of audience psychology. The psychological brilliance of Scar's fate lies in its mirror structure. Throughout the film, Scar betrays his own family, first his brother, then his nephew, and finally his entire pride. His ending forces him to experience the same betrayal he inflicted on others, but amplified. The hyena's rebellion against Scar provides audiences with a form of justice that feels both inevitable and deeply satisfying. It's not external punishment. It's the natural consequence of Scar's own psychological patterns turned against him. This shift towards psychological poetic justice marked a fundamental change in Disney's approach to villain endings. Earlier villains faced punishment that came from outside their moral universe: princes, fairy godmothers, or natural forces. Renaissance villains, however, created the conditions of their own destruction through their psychological flaws. This evolution reflects Disney's recognition that audiences had become more psychologically sophisticated and required more complex emotional satisfaction. Jafar's progression across Aladdin and its sequels reveals another layer of this psychological evolution. His initial transformation into a genie seems like punishment, but it's actually a corruption of his greatest desire: ultimate power. Disney discovered that the most psychologically satisfying villain endings came not from denying villains what they wanted, but from giving it to them in ways that revealed its true nature. Jafar achieves cosmic power but loses his freedom, a psychological prison more devastating than any external punishment. The genius of this approach lies in how it makes audiences complicit in the villain's psychological destruction. When Jafar demands to become the most powerful genie in the universe, audiences recognize the trap even as the villain walks into it. This creates a unique form of psychological satisfaction where viewers feel intellectually superior to the villain while simultaneously enjoying their self-inflicted downfall. Disney had discovered how to make audiences feel both morally justified and intellectually validated. Frollo's ending in The Hunchback of Notre Dame pushed this psychological framework to its logical extreme. His final moments, falling from Notre Dame while clutching a stone gargoyle that breaks away, represent the ultimate fusion of religious symbolism and psychological breakdown. Frollo doesn't just fall physically, he experiences complete moral and psychological collapse. His obsession with purity and control literally brings down the structure he believed represented divine authority. The psychological complexity of Frollo's demise reveals how sophisticated Disney's understanding of audience psychology had become. His ending satisfies multiple psychological needs simultaneously: moral justice, religious symbolism, and psychological poetic justice. The gargoyle that breaks under his weight represents the false nature of his moral authority, while his fall from the cathedral symbolizes his spiritual corruption. Audiences experience layered satisfaction that operates on conscious and unconscious levels. This Renaissance pattern, villains destroying themselves through their obsessions, represents a profound shift in how Disney approached audience psychology. Earlier films had provided clear moral lessons about good triumphing over evil. Renaissance films offered something more psychologically complex: lessons about how evil corrupts and ultimately consumes itself. This subtle but crucial difference reflects Disney's evolution from moral educator to psychological manipulator. The audience conditioning during this era became far more sophisticated than simple moral programming. Renaissance Disney trained viewers to find satisfaction not just in justice being served, but in watching villains participate in their own psychological destruction. This created a generation of viewers who derived pleasure from psychological complexity rather than simple moral resolution. Perhaps most disturbingly, this era established the expectation that truly satisfying villain endings required psychological sophistication rather than simple punishment. Audiences began to crave villains who would destroy themselves through their own flaws, creating a demand for increasingly complex forms of psychological manipulation in entertainment. Disney had successfully conditioned viewers to prefer psychological torture over straightforward justice. The Renaissance period also revealed Disney's growing awareness of adult psychology within children's entertainment. These villain endings operated on multiple levels simultaneously, providing simple moral satisfaction for young viewers while offering psychological complexity for adult audiences. This dual-layer approach allowed Disney to conduct psychological experiments on viewers across all age demographics. The systematic nature of this evolution suggests that Disney recognized the potential to use villain endings as vehicles for more sophisticated psychological conditioning. By making villains complicit in their own destruction, Disney created a framework where audiences could enjoy elaborate psychological punishment while maintaining moral superiority. The villains deserved their fate because they chose it themselves. This Renaissance revolution in villain psychology set the stage for even more disturbing developments in Disney's approach to moral conditioning. The company had discovered that audiences derived greater satisfaction from watching evil destroy itself than from seeing it defeated by external forces. This insight would prove crucial as Disney moved into an era where traditional concepts of good and evil became increasingly complex. The modern era of Disney storytelling represents the most psychologically sophisticated period in the company's history, and potentially the most disturbing. Where previous generations of Disney films trained audiences to expect specific types of villain endings, contemporary Disney has mastered something far more insidious: the ability to manipulate audience expectations about morality itself. The villain endings of the past 2 decades reveal a company that has moved beyond simple moral conditioning into the realm of psychological experimentation on a massive scale. The shift becomes immediately apparent when examining how modern Disney handles villain endings compared to their classical approach. Traditional Disney villains faced clear moral consequences. They were punished, transformed, or destroyed according to established patterns that audiences had been conditioned to find satisfying. Modern Disney villains often experience something far more psychologically complex: moral ambiguity that forces audiences to question their own ethical frameworks. Toy Story 3's Lotso represents perhaps the most psychologically manipulative villain ending in Disney's catalog. His fate, abandoned and strapped to the front of a garbage truck, conscious and aware but powerless to change his situation, operates as a form of psychological torture that would be considered cruel and unusual punishment in any legal system. Yet audiences find this ending satisfying, even appropriate. The psychological conditioning that makes this response possible reveals how successfully Disney has trained viewers to accept elaborate psychological punishment as justice. The genius of Lotso's ending lies in its plausible deniability. Disney can claim they're simply showing consequences rather than punishment, but the psychological effect on audiences is clear. This villain deserves to suffer indefinitely for his actions. The conditioning runs so deep that viewers don't question why eternal psychological torment represents appropriate justice for the crime of being a bitter toy. Disney has successfully programmed audiences to accept cruelty as long as it's directed toward characters they've been conditioned to view as irredeemable. This modern approach reflects Disney's recognition that contemporary audiences have become more psychologically sophisticated, but also more morally flexible. Where earlier generations demanded clear moral resolution, modern viewers can be conditioned to accept complex moral situations as long as they feel psychologically satisfied with the outcome. Disney has learned to exploit this flexibility to conduct increasingly elaborate experiments in moral conditioning. The institutional versus personal villain dynamic in modern Disney films reveals another layer of psychological manipulation. Films like Zootopia and Monsters, Inc. present systemic evil rather than individual villainy, requiring different psychological approaches to audience satisfaction. When institutions are revealed as corrupt, individual villains become symbols rather than characters, allowing Disney to explore more complex moral territories while maintaining audience comfort. Bellwether's ending in Zootopia demonstrates this institutional approach to villain psychology. Her fate, presumably legal consequences within the system she tried to corrupt, feels anticlimactic compared to classical Disney villain endings. But this anticlimax serves a specific psychological function. It conditions audiences to accept that some evil is too complex for simple moral resolution. Disney has trained viewers to find satisfaction in incomplete justice as long as the systemic problem is acknowledged. This evolution toward institutional evil reflects Disney's understanding that modern audiences require more sophisticated moral conditioning than previous generations. Contemporary society grapples with complex systemic issues that resist simple good versus evil narratives. Disney has adapted by creating villain endings that condition audiences to accept moral complexity while maintaining psychological satisfaction through symbolic victories rather than actual resolution. The redemption versus elimination dynamic in modern Disney represents perhaps the most psychologically manipulative aspect of contemporary villain treatment. Films like Frozen, Moana, and Encanto present villains who aren't eliminated but transformed through understanding and acceptance. This shift appears progressive on the surface, but the psychological implications are more disturbing. Disney is conditioning audiences to believe that appropriate moral response depends on the villain's psychological profile rather than their actions. Hans from Frozen provides a perfect example of this selective moral framework. His ending, public humiliation and deportation, feels appropriate because audiences have been conditioned to view him as irredeemably narcissistic. Meanwhile, Elsa's similar actions, endangering the kingdom through emotional instability, receive forgiveness because audiences are conditioned to view her as redeemable. Disney has successfully trained viewers to apply different moral standards based on character psychology, rather than consistent ethical principles. This psychological selectivity reveals Disney's most sophisticated form of audience conditioning, teaching viewers that moral judgment should be based on perceived psychological complexity rather than actual harm caused. Audiences learn to excuse destructive behavior from characters they're conditioned to view sympathetically, while demanding harsh punishment for characters they're programmed to see as irredeemable. The psychological manipulation extends to how modern Disney shapes audience expectations about real-world justice and conflict resolution. By presenting redemption as possible for some villains but not others, Disney conditions viewers to believe that appropriate response to wrongdoing depends on psychological assessment rather than consistent moral principles. This framework has profound implications for how audiences process real-world conflicts and justice issues. Perhaps most disturbingly, modern Disney has learned to make audiences complicit in moral decision-making, rather than simply accepting predetermined outcomes. Films present complex moral situations where audiences must psychologically participate in determining appropriate consequences for villains. This participation creates deeper psychological investment in Disney's moral framework and more effective conditioning than passive consumption of predetermined moral lessons. The systematic nature of these modern approaches suggests that Disney has moved beyond entertainment into active psychological experimentation. The company appears to be testing how much moral complexity audiences can accept while maintaining psychological satisfaction, how effectively they can condition viewers to apply selective moral standards, and how deeply they can influence audience. Thinking about justice and redemption, the most unsettling aspect of this modern approach is how naturally audiences accept it. The psychological conditioning has become so sophisticated that viewers rarely question why they find certain villain endings satisfying while others feel incomplete. This unconscious acceptance suggests that Disney's psychological programming has achieved unprecedented effectiveness, creating generations of viewers whose moral intuitions have been shaped by carefully crafted entertainment experiences. The implications extend far beyond entertainment consumption. Disney's modern approach to villain psychology influences how audiences think about real-world conflicts, justice systems, and moral decision-making. The company has gained unprecedented power to shape societal attitudes toward complex moral issues through seemingly innocent entertainment choices. But the most disturbing revelation is yet to come. The patterns we've examined, from early moral conditioning through Renaissance psychological complexity to modern moral manipulation, reveal a comprehensive system of audience psychology management that goes far deeper than anyone has previously recognized. The comprehensive analysis of Disney villain endings across nearly a century of storytelling reveals something far more disturbing than simple entertainment choices or evolving narrative techniques. When examined as a complete system, Disney's approach to villain psychology represents one of the most successful programs of mass psychological conditioning in human history. The company hasn't just been telling stories, they've been systematically programming the moral instincts of entire generations through carefully engineered emotional responses. The master pattern that emerges from this analysis is breathtaking in its scope and sophistication. Disney identified that villain endings carry enormous psychological weight in moral development, particularly for young viewers whose ethical frameworks are still forming. By controlling these endings across decades of globally distributed content, Disney gained unprecedented power to influence how millions of people think about justice, punishment, redemption, and moral resolution. The psychological programming operates on multiple levels simultaneously. On the conscious level, audiences believe they're simply enjoying entertainment where good triumphs over evil. On the unconscious level, they're internalizing specific frameworks for moral judgment that will influence their thinking for the rest of their lives. The villain endings serve as moral education disguised as entertainment, creating deep psychological conditioning that most viewers never recognize or question. Consider the implications of this systematic approach. Children who grew up with Disney films learned not just that evil should be punished, but that specific types of evil deserve specific types of punishment. They internalized expectations about proportional justice, the satisfaction of seeing power corrupted by its own nature, and the comfort of watching moral complexity resolved through predetermined frameworks. These psychological patterns don't disappear in adulthood. They become the foundation for how individuals process real-world moral dilemmas. The cultural impact extends far beyond individual psychology into societal expectations about justice systems, conflict resolution, and moral decision-making. Disney's influence on how audiences think about punishment and redemption has shaped public attitudes toward criminal justice, political conflicts, and social issues. The psychological frameworks established through villain endings influence voting behavior, policy preferences, and social attitudes in ways that most people never consciously recognize. The hidden agenda theory becomes increasingly compelling when examining the systematic nature of Disney's approach. The consistency across decades, the careful evolution of techniques, and the sophisticated understanding of audience psychology suggest intentionality that goes far beyond entertainment purposes. Disney appears to have recognized early in their history that they possessed unprecedented power to influence moral development on a global scale. This influence operates through what psychologists call parasocial relationships, the emotional connections audiences form with fictional characters. When viewers experience satisfaction from villain endings, they're not just enjoying narrative resolution. They're reinforcing psychological patterns that will influence how they process real-world conflicts and moral dilemmas. Disney has essentially weaponized emotional entertainment to conduct mass psychological conditioning. The most uncomfortable truth revealed by this analysis concerns what audience enjoyment of these villain endings says about human psychology. The satisfaction derived from watching elaborate psychological punishment, the comfort found in seeing power corrupted by its own nature, and the pleasure taken in moral complexity resolved through violence or humiliation. These responses reveal disturbing aspects of human nature that Disney has learned to exploit. The psychological programming has been so successful that most audiences cannot imagine alternative approaches to villain resolution. The idea that antagonists might be rehabilitated rather than punished, that moral conflicts might be resolved through understanding rather than elimination, or that justice might focus on restoration rather than retribution, these concepts feel unsatisfying to viewers who have been conditioned to expect Disney's psychological frameworks. Perhaps most disturbingly, Disney has conditioned audiences to find moral complexity satisfying only when it serves predetermined narrative functions. Modern Disney films present redemption as possible for some villains, but not others, training viewers to believe that appropriate moral response depends on character psychology rather than consistent ethical principles. This selective moral framework has profound implications for how audiences process real-world justice issues. The systematic nature of this psychological conditioning raises fundamental questions about the relationship between entertainment and social control. When does moral education become propaganda? At what point does entertainment cross the line into psychological manipulation? And what are the ethical implications of a single corporation wielding such enormous influence over global moral development? The evidence suggests that Disney has been conducting a decades-long experiment in moral conditioning, disguised as entertainment. The systematic approach to villain psychology, the careful evolution of techniques, and the sophisticated understanding of audience response patterns indicate a level of intentionality that goes far beyond simple storytelling choices. Disney has essentially created a comprehensive moral education system that operates below conscious awareness. The implications for democratic society are profound. When a single entertainment corporation can influence how millions of people think about justice, punishment, and moral resolution, the potential for social manipulation becomes enormous. Disney's psychological programming doesn't just shape individual moral intuitions. It influences collective attitudes toward policy, governance, and social organization. The most disturbing aspect of this revelation is how naturally audiences accept and defend the psychological conditioning they've experienced. When confronted with analysis of Disney's systematic approach to moral programming, most viewers respond with emotional attachment to the very frameworks that have been used to condition them. This defensive response suggests that the psychological programming has achieved its intended purpose, creating populations who will actively resist recognition of their own conditioning. The long-term cultural consequences of Disney's psychological programming are only beginning to become apparent. Generations raised on carefully engineered moral frameworks are now making decisions about governance, justice systems, and social organization based on psychological patterns established through entertainment consumption. The indirect influence of Disney villain endings on contemporary political and social attitudes represents one of the most successful forms of soft power projection in human history. The question that emerges from this analysis is not whether Disney has been conducting psychological conditioning through villain endings. The evidence for systematic moral programming is overwhelming. The question is whether audiences are willing to recognize and critically examine the moral frameworks that have been programmed into their thinking through decades of carefully engineered entertainment experiences. The ultimate revelation is that Disney's greatest achievement hasn't been creating memorable characters or innovative animation. It's been successfully programming the moral instincts of multiple generations while making them grateful for the experience. The psychological conditioning has been so effective that audiences continue to seek out and defend the very entertainment forms that have been used to manipulate their moral development. This analysis forces uncomfortable questions about individual moral autonomy and the nature of ethical thinking. How much of what we consider our personal moral intuition has actually been programmed through entertainment consumption? Can we distinguish between authentic moral reasoning and conditioned responses to predetermined frameworks? And most disturbingly, if our moral intuitions have been systematically influenced by entertainment corporations, What does that say about the nature of moral reasoning in contemporary society? The Disney villain ending system represents more than entertainment history. It's a case study in how psychological conditioning can be disguised as cultural enrichment. The next time you find yourself emotionally satisfied by a villain's elaborate downfall, remember, that satisfaction isn't natural or inevitable. It's been carefully engineered by a company that understood the power of moral programming, long before audiences recognized they were being programmed. The question isn't whether Disney will continue this psychological conditioning. They've already proven its effectiveness beyond doubt. The question is whether audiences will develop the critical awareness necessary to recognize and resist moral programming disguised as entertainment. Because until we understand how our moral instincts have been shaped by corporate interests, we remain vulnerable to psychological manipulation through the very stories we use to understand right and wrong.